welcome to On the Media's very first live stream ever.
Good afternoon, I'm Joe Baker, a member of the Delaware Tribe of Indians.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us to celebrate Anna Sale and her new book, Let's Talk About Hard Things. I'm going to show you my copy of the book. It is already stained with coffee and tea and bits of food and crumbs, and I think that is the way it should be with a book like this. If you know Anna, if you know her podcast, Death, Sex, and Money, you know that she bizarrely and virtuously really does like leaning into tough conversations. It is the way Anna is. And she and I have been friends for, I just learned from her, it's close to 12 years now. And I have always thought that Anna's brain is wired a little bit differently than everybody else's because of this talent and because of this desire to learn more about people, to uncover the difficult things about people. And I think that when it comes to somebody whose brain is a little bit different, you should try to learn from them. And this book is a really good example. This book is a really good way of learning from somebody who has a particular view about the world and who tries to be hopeful. So underpinning a lot of Anna's work is this question: why don't we talk about certain things? Why are certain things taboo? And what do we lose when we make certain things taboo? And what might we gain if we just said, it's actually okay to talk about that? So the book is a blend of memoir, research, and also interviews that Anna has done with fancy people, celebrities, household names, and a lot of ordinary people as well who have shared their stories. And throughout the course of the next hour, we're going to talk about how the book came together, some of the people in it, and we're going to talk a bit about how Anna got to be where she is tonight. Anna, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks, Noel. I'm so excited to do this with you.
So I just described you in ways that I usually only do behind your back, which is to say you're a little different, I think. What do you think? Am I being fair?
You know, I don't think of myself as being wired that much differently than most people. I don't know, maybe, I don't know, particularly from other journalists. Like, I feel like when you are someone who chooses to be a journalist, you are someone who is like, I'm going to look out and try to gather information on what is happening in the world. And then I'm going to tell you. And I'm going to tell you in ways that, might be upsetting, might be uncomfortable, but the alternative is to pretend it's not happening. And I think that maybe it's unusual to sort of really put that lens on the most private, tender parts of ourselves. But I sort of think of it as the curiosity is a journalistic instinct. It's like, tell me what that was like. I want to understand. And I want to understand because there are parts of that I might relate to, there are parts of it that other people might relate to, or there are parts of it that might be quite different than what I have experienced or what people listening have experienced, and that's useful for them to hear as well.
I remember a story you told me when we first met. We were young producers at WNYC, and you were telling me about a trip you had taken to Afghanistan as a reporter for West Virginia Public Radio. And you had been sent on this trip to cover the troops and the war, and it was a very big deal. And you said you found yourself talking to a gentleman And instead of asking him about the war, you started asking him about his marriage. And you found yourself really wanting to know what that experience was like, being away from his wife, trying to deal with that being in Afghanistan. And I remember at the time, having come from the background of conflict reporting myself, thinking, just having met you, thinking, oh, she's doing something different. So even at a young age, I think it seems like there was part of you that understood there was a certain line of questioning that really interested you. And that line of questioning was about what is your life and what is it like being you in this very extreme situation, but having to deal with all of the regular stuff that everybody has to deal with, like having a spouse.
Yeah, I like that you brought that up, because I actually have thought back on that. That was in like 2007. And I was embedded with the West Virginia Air Guard. And so these are people for whom a lot of them were volunteers. So they had many other lives. They were, weekend warrior type people. And then all of a sudden they were called up to go to Bagram Air Base. And I just remember being fascinated by like, wait, how does just being sent off to war fit into how are you making this fit into your life and not? And that's that. I'm not sure that's what West Virginia Public Radio thought they were going to get when they sent me to be embedded with the troops, but that's what I was really interested in. I was like, I think because it was, these were all people from the area, from West Virginia, and then all of a sudden we were all together at Bagram Air Base, and it's like, wait, what's your relationship to home? Like, you go out for beers with this guy because, when you're back training, you're all from West Virginia. It's not like you're all getting mixed up and now all together meeting each other. But that I did do one piece in particular. One guy was a husband and he was deploying, and I went with him. And then his wife, also in the Guard, flying home. And they had 2 little kids. So I was like, so it ended up being a piece where it was sort of me talking to the husband and me talking to the wife, and they were talking about each other, but not being present with each other. And I wanted to know how that family worked.
Early death, sex, and money. You are a very proud child of West Virginia. You write about this in the book. You write about something that I did not know as a New Yorker. A lot of people have thoughts about West Virginia and preconceived notions about West Virginia, and not all of them are great. And one of the things that you discovered as you went out into the world, went to the Bay Area for college, to Stanford, was that your West Virginia was something that people were going to kind of judge you by. Talk a little bit about your pride in being where you're from and how it shapes you today, even though it's been some years since you've lived there full time.
Yeah, I left in 2008. That's the beginning of the chapter about talking about identity, because I was like, what is the way in which I have felt, there is something really core to me that connects me to people in a really deep way, even when I don't know them. And then there's ways this is core to me and I feel completely misread by other people. And I wrote about like what the experience was like to leave West Virginia, and I just kind of thought, like, when you grow up somewhere, you have an attachment to home. Like, there's this feeling of like, this is who we are. And then when you leave, I would meet other people who had a very strong attachment to home. And certainly I did in California, but I met a lot of people who just like didn't care where they were from. Like, I just really, like, that was the question that I would ask someone after learn their name. Like, where are you from? Like, help me understand what part of the country you're from, what part of the world, like, tell me about your family. Like, I wanted to know that. And I realized, like, oh, for other people, this doesn't matter as much. And being from West Virginia, people sort of either have a whole set of ideas about the place that are mostly negative, which is like, this is a place that is struggling economically, where there's not a lot of opportunity. More recently, it's where there's a lot of people who are racist, a lot of people who are uncomfortable with changes, demographic changes happening in America. Like, these are sort of the big ideas about West Virginia. And then there's also like a ton of people who just like, it's not even a place that registers as worthy enough to even have an idea about, like, I found that particularly among Californians. There's sort of like anything outside of California, it doesn't really matter. So of course, my experience of identity then was like, oh, you don't know about my place? I'm going to double down and I'm going to like be the most West Virginia that I can be. And I, to an absurd extent, like I would, I can remember listening to Merle Haggard's Okie from Muskogee in my dorm room on Stanford University's campus. Like, it's ridiculous, like I was some, I don't know, working class hero. And I just like, it was just sort of, I was just trying to figure out, where do I belong? Who am I? But the other thing about being from West Virginia is like, I think it totally affects the way I like read political situations. I think about like who's being left out, like what are the outside interests that are gaining here, because that was a big phenomenon in West Virginia. But I also am very aware, like, oh, you can't, in most professional settings, like if I don't mention where I grew up, I just look like any other coastal like reporter who lives in an urban area. And so that's the other sort of key part to how I think about how I talk about identity. Like I can sort of like pass and shapeshift, and it's not something, I don't have to take on people's ideas about what West Virginia means unless I disclose that I'm from West Virginia. And I think that's a really core difference from a lot of people, and how, depending on sort of what categories they're identified as slotting into.
And when you do interviews with people and have these conversations, some of them very difficult, about how the rest of the world sees them versus how they see themselves, especially in an era and at a time where I think overwhelmingly white Americans are starting to understand that the experiences in this country of Black Americans and of other people of color are actually quite different than theirs. It has always been a difficult conversation to have. I think in some ways it became easier after George Floyd was killed, because everyone was having the conversation all of a sudden. But I think in other ways it became harder because people's defenses were up, and my defenses were up. I know you and I talked about that at one point last summer. When you're talking to someone who comes from a different background and you're hearing them talk through the process of how the world sees them and how the world presents them back to themselves, how does being from West Virginia help in situations like that?
I don't know if it's because I'm from West Virginia, and I think that it's not been intuitive for me. There's been a lot of learning about, like, as an interviewer, I think one of the things that sort of motivated me at the beginning was like, help me understand you, help me like get it, like inhabit what's happened in your world. So I want to ask really concrete questions about your life, and I want to pull you out. And so that's kind of the emotional space I try to go into. But when you're talking across like really important identity differences, I think the thing that I've just really tried to concentrate on is the sort of like allowing myself to not understand, and like to not, and that's okay, like not to sort of force whatever my own experience has been on what someone else is telling me. Does that make sense? Sort of like sit in the space of like, oh, what you're describing to me is never going to be intuitive to me because that's not how I have moved through the world. But to go back to your original question, how has being from West, I don't know, what do you think? What have you observed about me?
I do have.
Okay, tell me your thesis.
I think that, I think it is because you are from West Virginia and because you understand what it is like to have a kind of dominant culture have negative ideas about the place that you're from. And because you're proud of the place that you're from, even if in college you went a little nuts, you are proud of being a West Virginian. I think it helps you get inside the heads of people who are seen broadly in the world as there is something wrong with that person might be dangerous, that person is not like us. Majority and minority cultures in the United States are fascinating to me. They always have been. And I think that there are different sorts of majority and minority cultures. And one of them, there's race, there's gender, there's ethnicity. There's also, as we both know, there's where you're from. You're from West Virginia. I am from a very rural, very small town. That's why we're friends. It is exactly why we're friends. It shapes every single interaction that I have. After 18 years in a town of 1,300 people, there are certain parts of rural America and certain things that I feel like I understand intuitively. And there are certain things about quote unquote city people, as my parents, city people would have called them, where I find myself baffled and I need to know more. I want to talk about your motive. I want to talk about the thing that underpins a lot of what you do. And you lay this out very clearly in the book. You talk about being a young kid who would turn to song lyrics and passages in books and notes that your sisters had written you. And you would take out the helpful bits or the bits that you thought were helpful. You would harvest them and you would kind of say, okay, this is the thing that's going to guide me through X, Y, or Z. Now, look, I've interviewed a lot of people in my life. I have never heard anyone say that they did that kind of psychological and emotional collaging to get themselves through young adulthood. Tell me a little bit about that, why you think you did it, and whether you still do it today.
Oh, I 100% still do it. I mean, the way I think that's what this work is. It's like trying to figure out how life works. I mean, I was in ninth grade, I was a freshman in high school doing a research paper, and we could pick anything to do a paper about. And I chose to do it about adolescent girls' psychological development and what was happening as they moved from being girls to women. And the book Reviving Ophelia was out at the time.
Oh,
it was like
yes.
very important to me. I mean, so I was like in the public library in Charleston, West Virginia, being like what, reading all the psychology books to be like, oh, it's difficult for me to understand the difference between thinking and feeling. It feels like I can't differentiate because of where my brain is. Like I was studying my own emotional experience as a way of, I think, coping with adolescence, So I think where the utility of thinking you can study and do homework, or where that ends, is like life is going to come at you no matter what. Like there's no hack. I think we just really want hacks to get us around the hard stuff. And I tried. I like collected all I had all these journals. I had all these conversations with older sisters. I've always had older mentors who I'm just like, how did you do that? And how did you do that? And I like just really cultivated those kinds of relationships. And then I still found myself at 30, like with my life turned upside down from anything that I thought it was going to be when my first marriage was falling apart. And everything that I thought I had sort of been laying the groundwork for fell out from under me. And then I had to sort of change the question, which was, how do I get through this? How do I get through this? Like, what are the small steps that I'm going to take this week and the next month, like to figure out what I want, and then how to make it so. And I think that sort of change in my life sort of powered, that kind of became why I was interested in Death, Sex, and Money, and this idea of like, let's accept the inevitability of these hard things. And then let's have conversations around how we each have encountered it. We can share that information, and we can get a lot of help from listening in to how other people talking about how they've made their way through. But it kind of allows you to sort of hurdle over the question of like, why did this terrible thing happen to me? Like, because terrible things are going to happen to each of us, and some people, terrible things, many more happen to some people than other people, but there's limits to each of our individual control. So how do we talk about what happens when that's going on in our lives?
You write about this very beautifully in the book and very openly in the book. And I hope you don't mind me sharing yet another anecdote that is actually not in the book, but about a decade ago, you and I were supposed to go to Washington, D.C. on a reporting trip together to cover, I think Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert was having some big rally in D.C. And I remember maybe a day before we were supposed to go, I was very excited. A day before we were supposed to go, you walked over to my desk and you said very quietly, I cannot come to Washington, D.C. I need to stay in town this weekend and work on my marriage. And that was it. And then you walked away. I had no idea what to think. We hadn't known each other for very long. And you had said it in such a quiet way that was kind of indecipherable. In the book, you talk a bunch about your first marriage, and understandably so, because it is one of those crucial, pivotal, capstone relationships. But talk a little bit about you and John and how you went from West Virginia and a marriage to all of a sudden being a very different person, living a very different life.
Yeah. That makes me, I feel so, I just want to hug that little person telling you that. She doesn't even take a day off work. She knows she can't do a work trip, but she's just going to say, I got to work on this. So looking back at what happened in my first marriage, it was it's like just really incredible. I met my ex-husband when I was in college, right before I started my senior year. He was also from West Virginia. He was a civil rights lawyer at the time. I was doing history of sort of civil rights histories of West Virginia for my thesis, and that's how we met. And it was like, we just like clicked. We just like got each other. We got that like where we were from was important to us, but we also liked art and movies and music. And, we would do these, the early years of our relationship were like going on road trips, and we would go to, it wasn't like a big city in Charleston. You had to go to the big cities to see the cool bands. So we would like do all these road trips, and it was really fun. And we were like best buds. We just were each other's person, and we were figuring out how to be adults together. And we were together for how many years? A lot of years before we got married. 4 or 5 years. And then we got married when I was 26. And about a year into our marriage, he said, I don't want to be a lawyer my whole life. I want to go to film school. I want to go to NYU. That's my dream. And I said, okay. That sounds really exciting. And then I don't know if that in that same conversation, but soon after came like, but what about me? What about us? Like, how does this work? And we did it. Like, he applied to film school. He got in. He got a full tuition scholarship. And it was 2009. And we decided to move to New York City. Another thing happening in 2009 was the financial crisis, which was also really impacting journalism and media opportunities in a really real way, because print was collapsing, podcasting hadn't really taken off. And so my experience of moving to New York was not, oh, I'm going to follow my dream. It was like, how am I going to pay rent? And now my husband is a student. So it was very scary for me. And it's sort of like we decided to do this adventure together. And then there would just be, it was like a very slow unraveling at first. It was like, we're doing this. Anna's freaked out, but we're doing this. And I think that we didn't recognize, it took us a long time to recognize, like we're making this big change because you want your life to be really different than what it is. And I didn't. I knew really deeply that I wanted to eventually have a place to live, have a family, like put down roots. And he didn't. He wanted to travel all over the world and do film projects and not think about stability and like go after his dreams. And we didn't know how to say that to one another. So instead we just would argue about like little things like, can we spend money on this? Can we spend money on that? Probably when I told you I have to stay in town for a weekend to work on my marriage, probably it was like right when all of that was cracking open, and we were just beginning to say, and we did the thing. We went to couples counseling, we read the books, we tried, we really tried to sort of sort it out together, and had a lot of hard conversations. And it wasn't until I was writing this book, it's been a long time since we've been apart. We broke up. It's been more than a decade. But it was in writing about those conversations and also interviewing him for the book that I realized, we didn't fail at having these hard conversations. Like we didn't not do what we were supposed to do. Like we actually had these hard conversations, and they revealed that we wanted different things. Because I think with my original sort of mindset about if you work really hard at talking about hard things, you can like reach an agreement, work it out, and instead we had hard conversations that revealed that we didn't we may have had a wonderful love story and grown up together and really like helped each other launch out into the world, but we didn't need to be married. And that was really sad. The conversations were sad and difficult, but we were doing them the right way because they eventually revealed that that's what we needed to learn from another.
You and John separated, and then there is a joke in our friend group, which I will let people in on. We all went out to a bar, a few of us, and we were young. We were, I don't know, 29, 30. We got a little too drunk and we said, this is going to be the summer of us. We are going to dance and meet men and drink and party. And then like 3 weeks later, you came to us and you were like, I think I've met someone. And Hot Girl Summer was completely canceled. But let's talk about the fella who you met, who you're married to today. You talk about Arthur in the book. He is a fascinating person. You guys complement each other in a lot of ways. Talk about how you met Arthur and how you transitioned from woman who's like young 20s, gonna go out there and just party to, wait, maybe that's not what I want. Because I have always wondered whether or not you regret that you didn't just party with us that summer.
Well, you know, I will just say, like, in my mind, that was still very much Hot Girl Summer. It just wasn't with a lot of other people. I just settled on who I was doing it with. Let's see, how did we meet? I mean, we met when I write about this. Like, it was a weekend away. I was kind of gonna go to a 4th of July party with friends, and I knew I was like self-conscious because it was like everybody else was couples, most of whom were married, most of whom knew each other from college, and I didn't. I was like a new friend. So felt as if I was like, it was like The Big Chill. Do you know that movie? The Big Chill. Yes. So it's like this reunion. Everybody knows each other. Everybody's married. And then I'm the like weird recent divorcee lady who shows up. Like what's her name? Jennifer Tilly in like in the leotard. So I was Jennifer Tilly, who was like the weird person who nobody else knows. But there was another single man who showed up this was on Cape Cod, and I'm like cutting a pineapple. I remember this. I'm cutting a pineapple in the kitchen for this big group dinner. And then this like man comes around the island and these shoulders, and he's like, "Hi, I'm Arthur." And I was like, "Hello. I don't know where you've come from, but you've made an impression." And then I was just like, who is this person? And it turned out, just like we've been talking about, like he was doing his graduate work in Laramie, Wyoming, and doing his field work in Northwest Wyoming, rural communities. And we talked a lot about just the politics of working where he worked. And I talked about West Virginia, and it was like, oh, there's things that we have to talk about. So we just started talking. And I liked talking to him, and he liked talking to me. But I was in a sort of like, you know, this is the summer of Anna. I'm not looking. That was what I called it.
That was the summer of Anna.
The summer of Anna. It was just beginning. And I was also just like, dude, here's what's going on with me. I am just like getting out of a marriage. I'm kind of a mess. I live, like it was just all on the table. And what I did notice was like, oh, he can like handle that. Like, he's not making me feel weird about kind of being, you know, the fact that there's a lot that's like up in the air and a little bit messy about me. Like, he's kind of like, just can handle it. And so we met that weekend, and then he flew back to Wyoming, and then I emailed him and said, like, I really liked meeting you. And then that just became, then we started talking on the phone. And then I was like, would you want to, I looked back at the email history because I was like, how long did it take? It was like within the week that he was like, do you want to come visit? And I'm like, well, it's summer of Anna. I haven't been to Wyoming as an adult. Like, yes, I will come. And then, but you know, I think I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to be like super interested in and committing to someone. I was still very much like finding how to stand on my own two legs. So that kind of became a thing that we had to work through while we knew each other and while we were deciding, what is this and how serious is it? And, and it took lots of years for me to feel like I wasn't like just to feel confident that I wasn't just jumping into another sort of slot because I was afraid of being alone. I had to like really sort of like test it, like, is this really what you like? Do I want this? Do you want this? What are we doing? And we broke up, and then we got back together. And yeah, I think I met him really quickly, and we very quickly knew that we really thought a lot of each other. And I think the thing that kept me in it was like, even when it was like, what are you doing? Like when I would get the most scared, I remember saying to people like, that's when we have some of the best conversations. Like he can talk to me about all the feelings. Like, and so that was a real sort of thing that was like, oh, that is very attractive to me. Like I can tell you all the feelings and all the mixed feelings and fears, and you can tell me your fears and mixed feelings, and we can both handle it. We don't have to protect each other from our, we don't have to protect each other. Like we can handle it. And that was like, oh, this is something that's a really important building block of a long-term relationship.
So as you and Arthur were getting to know each other and your personal life was sort of starting to figure itself out, you at WNYC were still known as a politics reporter. You had come from West Virginia, you'd done Connecticut, you'd now done New York City. And I think a lot of people at the station viewed you as the woman who will cover politics for the rest of her career. She's really good at it. She gets the politicians to open up. And then WNYC holds this competition and says, does anyone have ideas for a new show? And I know that you've told this story before, and I'm sure a lot of people listening have heard it, but one of the things that I'm incredibly curious about, there was a perception of you as person who does X. And inside you were like, but I'm a person who wants to do Y. So I know that you went ahead and you pitched the show and it worked out and it's Death, Sex, and Money. But I'm very curious about what it took inside of you to get up the guts to be like, I don't want to be politics lady. I want to be Death, Sex, and Money lady.
It was scary.
Was it?
Yeah. Well, I think what I remember really worrying about is, are people going to still take me seriously? Because I had worked really hard in my journalism career up to that point. How long had I? Not yet 10 years, but I'd been covering politics for about that. And like, to sort of like, when you come up as a young woman reporter in the State House, like there's always the like men reporters who've been covering the budget for like 25 years. And they're like, you should look at this line item over here, And so part of my project as a young reporter was like, I'm going to impress those dudes. Like, I want them to think like she is smart. She like is seeing stories that other people are missing. And she's like, we need to be afraid of her. Like I wanted to compete, And, but I think when I think about that transition, it kind of critically in between, like I did a lot of coverage of just talking to voters, around political campaigns, and around the 2012 presidential campaign. I did road trips and just like found voters where they lived and would ask them to tell me how they thought things were going for their family. And that was very similar to the work that I have continued to do on Death, Sex, and Money, but just in a very different container. It was like a soundbite that I would put at the top of a story about polls and how, Mitt Romney was up here in this county because X and so-and-so says this about how things are going, but the actual work of getting those people to open up was very similar to what I continue to do. But I had to just like kind of decide that it was worth trying, even if I had to like, it was like almost like giving myself a pep talk. Like, I know I'm doing stuff that's meaningful, even though it's not going into the like serious journalism box in the same way. Like, I know that I need these kinds of interviews and conversations. And I think that if I can apply what I've learned covering Medicaid budgets and campaigns to like helping us feel more competent in our personal lives, like that's meaningful. But I did have to just sort of get to the place of being like, if you don't get what I'm doing, it's okay. Like I am confident in what the vision is. And I know that I'm still doing journalism that matters.
When you first pitched the show, who did you want to listen? Who was it for?
Oh, it's like I have a pitch document that I look back on every so often, and it's so weird and dated now. Because it was like 2013 when I was first making my notes, and it was stuff like, I reference Oprah and I reference Lena Dunham. I reference like, but I did think initially, I was like, okay, so at that time I'm like 33, turning 34. I'm in a relationship. I'm divorced. I'm not sure if I'm going to have kids or be able to have kids. I don't really know what I want to do for work and where I want to live. Like I'm in this tumult. Like, I bet there are people like me who could use this show. So that was like the original sort of like, I think there's a need that this would, an itch that this would scratch. And I picture myself as the audience. And I think that what's been so cool about making the show is like the listeners have continually sort of like banged their fist at my own conception of like who wants a show like this and who to invite in and who to lift up. And so it's been this like really fun like way of just like me being like, now I don't think like, oh, I'm sure this is a story that our listeners would like, because I don't really know what that means. Like, I think more like this show is for people who are like in it, like they're in a moment of just like, ugh, how are other people doing this? Or who've been through it and now are like anything, like it being really broad, like, but who've just like trudged through something and kind of like are in that practice of like building the vocabulary for how to like talk about their emotional lives. And Katie Bishop, our executive producer, she slacked me like just a couple months ago. She's like, I think our show is for people who are either curious about therapy or are already in therapy. I was like, that could mean a lot of people. Right. And also it's quite specific.
Is there any group that you hear from? And by group, I mean, like, do you occasionally hear from a handful of a type of person where you're like, oh my goodness, you're listening to the show. I didn't realize it. Are there any surprises?
Oh, one person I just love to hear, like I see him on Twitter. Sometimes he favorites my tweets. Ernie in Vallejo, California. He must be now in his later 70s, but I first met him because we did an episode where we just asked people to tell us about living alone, your experiences of living alone. And I, of course, was in this experience of, I had lived with my husband and then I was divorced and I'd lived in a college dorm before that and then with my family before that. So I had never lived alone. So I'm like thinking of it in terms of like living on your own, career woman in the city. Ernie lives in a trailer in Vallejo, California, in a trailer park, and he had split up from his wife and didn't really want to, but now is living on his own. And he initially just told us about his story of like how he has found, what he does. I think you talked about baking pies in his trailer in that first episode, and I interviewed him and said like, Ernie, like, just curious, like, how did you find dead sex and money? And he had a job where he worked the night shift and he was kind of on his own, and he had somehow, gotten onto Radiolab or something. Somehow, some way he had made his way to Death, Sex and Money, and we had become part of his lineup. And years later, when we were working on an episode about our series about class and how each of us sort of define our class identities, I went to Ernie's trailer in Vallejo because now he lives not far from me out here in California, and got to spend time in his house and interview him about his own sort of class transition. He sort of opted out was his experience of kind of opted out of kind of trying to hustle upper middle class life and is quite happy. But Ernie is somebody who I just love, like, oh, you're listening, you know. I also like hearing from people who are in, really far away, not in the United States, who just have an internet connection and they find us. You never know with the internet.
I remember being in Baltimore on a reporting assignment for Planet Money at a construction site. And there was this very handsome construction worker, very handsome. And he asked me what I was doing. And I said, I'm a reporter, this, that, and the other. He said, who do you work for? I said, a podcast called Planet Money. And he said, oh, do you know the podcast Death, Sex, and Money? Is it like that? And I was like, no, but my friend hosts that. And then I gave him my number, thinking that he would call me, and he never did. So there you go.
If you're listening, construction worker.
You're out there, sir. Handsome Baltimore construction worker. So you started the show. The show actually took off. I mean, it was an instant hit. It was something that I think people had been craving for a couple of reasons in particular, but there's one I want to ask you about specifically, which is, you and I have never discussed religion or your religious background, but I will admit the one thing about Death, Sex, and Money that I sometimes have to skip through, and the one thing in the book that I had to it's the sex part. And I was not raised in a deeply religious household. I had Catholicism looming over me, but I'm not baptized or confirmed. I have trouble with the sex part. And I am very curious how it could be that I assume you were raised going to church on occasion. I know you have a big family with a lot of sisters, but what exactly gives you the confidence to speak so openly about sex and to write so openly about sex? And what is, for someone like me who's still reading through my fingers, what is the value of it?
Okay, let's see. Well, I was raised Unitarian Universalist, going to church. But if you know anything about Unitarians, like, they figure out ways to talk about sex and for sex to be okay.
And there you have it.
So I think that's pretty important. I also was raised, my dad is a doctor, my mom's a physical therapist. So I was like raised where with this idea, like a kind of conversation about the body and how the body worked and how we talked about, and like we're taught about sex by my parents and my family was kind of like, this is an extension of a way bodies work. Like, my parents told me how babies were made when I was young. Like, my dad was telling me like a nighttime story. We were at the beach, and it was like, well, he told stories. He would make up these stories about Strawberry Shortcake and her family. And one night, Strawberry's parents decided they wanted to have another kid. And I was young enough that I was like, what? So, I think that, like, it's like, okay, this is like part of how bodies work. But then I guess, like, how I think about my comfort and what I chose to write about in the book, like, like, I'm a married woman who has 2 little kids. And like, I will tell you, I think it's important for you to know that, like, pleasure is something that I think people deserve and can figure out. Like, it's important to, like, give yourself permission to explore how to talk about in relationships. I also believe that, like, there's lots of different ways that you can have sort of ethical sex lives. Like, you can choose, there's not one way to be moral when it comes to sex. You can choose, like, you can choose with your partners, like, whether you're monogamous, whether you're not, who you sleep with, how many people you sleep with, like, so I think that those are sort of the bedrock things that I'm like, ooh, is this okay to say? And I'm like, well, it's pretty clear that I have had sex because I got pregnant, and I have 2 kids. So that's clear. So I wasn't really, like, saying anything that people probably didn't know about me. And then I also think it's like, there's a section in the book about, like, about married sex, and especially, like, early parenthood sex, and about, and the reason I wrote that is because I think it's important to talk about sex. There's a lot of cultural conversation about the right ways to talk about hookups and consent and what you want to do with someone. for the first time, like when you're having that conversation, like how to make sure you're both on board and want the same thing. But I wanted to also focus on sex conversations within the context of longer relationships, because our bodies change, our hormones change, we want, our stress levels change, and that's also okay. Like that's part of living in a body. Like, and so that's why I chose to tell that story. I tell a story about my OBGYN after I had my first child, like kind of opening up the conversation about like, how's it going? How's it going? Intimacy with your husband, which was like, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe he's asking this. And then I was like, but it ended up being such a nice conversation, because we talked about whether I wanted to have a second kid, like what, I was was in my later 30s at that point. And so he just wanted me to sort of like, he was like, if you can open up the conversation about how you are relating to each other physically, that can be good, because that way you don't immediately go into like high stakes, we need to get pregnant, sex. Like you don't go from 0 to 60, which I thought was just really good advice. So that's why I chose to write about that. So I'm looking at your face and I'm like, this is a part of me that Noel's like, Anna's brain is different.
Yes, no, it truly is. It truly, as I read through Peaked Fingers, as I fast forward, I will urge everyone, if they have not heard the episode with Lucinda Williams, to go back and listen, because that was one of the funniest and most extraordinary things about our changing bodies that I had ever heard in a podcast. I put down my phone and walked slowly away from it. Obviously, this is my deal. I'll get through it. So tell me, let's talk about now. You and Arthur got together. It took some time. It took a lot of conversations. You guys had to negotiate a bunch. And then in 2015, I think you moved across the country with a new husband and a baby inside you, and a show that was still relatively new. Talk about that 1 month, maybe. What was that road trip like?
Oh man, that was wild. We got married in 2015, and then I very quickly got pregnant, and then Arthur got a job in California, and we had to be like, oh wait, whoa, like how are we going to do this? Can you do your show? Like, do you have to leave your show? Do you have to get a new job? Like all these big open questions. And even like, where do we want to have the baby? If we're moving while you're pregnant, like, do you want to have the baby in New York City, have the baby in California where we didn't have housing yet? I mean, there was a lot that was just like, buckle up. But we sort of figured it out. And I think Arthur taught me a lot of, I can tend to be very like to-do list and what are the things that need to happen to make this work. And Arthur is the one in our relationship who's like, hang on, what's the vision? Like, what are we after here? And he was the one who was like, nature is very important to him. For him, there was a moment where he was like, I don't want my baby's first experience in the world to be getting in a cab in Manhattan. Like I want to have my kid because there's a possibility I would like to have our kid in a different environment. So we decided to not go to California, but to go halfway. And we decided I would do my maternity leave in Wyoming, which is where we got married in Cody. So we packed up our Brooklyn apartment. I figured out with WNYC that I could work remotely, and the rest of the team would stay in New York City, and they're still in New York City. And then we got on a plane with our dog, and the rest of our stuff was in a truck on its way to Wyoming. And 36 weeks pregnant, I arrived in Wyoming, and I had a baby 3 weeks later.
And then I with the full understanding that there will be people who get mad at me for asking this question, and I tip my cap to them. having a child, because I don't have any kids. I have a dog. Does that change the way you do a very specific thing, which is to sit down and to concentrate and to listen and to focus, but also to do a ton of research about the people that you're talking to and to know where you want to go in a conversation and what you want to ask. And a kid is a curveball. It is a lot of energy and it is a lot of attention that have to go elsewhere. How has becoming a mom changed the way you work, or changed the show, or how you feel about the show?
Mm-hmm. I think it's made it, I mean, certainly I have more constraints on what sounds appealing, right?
Mm.
Like, it doesn't sound appealing to me in like before I was a parent. Like if somebody said, we're going to give you a van and a recorder and you're going to take 2 months to get across the country and you're just going to do episodes along the way, I would have been like, here for it. That is the dream.
Yes.
And now I'm like, okay, I will travel, but when do I leave? When do I get back? Because I'm going to have to figure out like how everything's going to work. So it's like, that's the biggest constraint, is like, I don't want to be away from home, you know? I think the other, like a way that it's worked for me as a working parent, and I realize this is really specific and a privilege of doing the kind of work that I do. I have set hours and I work East Coast hours. So I get out of bed when the rest of the house is quiet and I just start my day. And Arthur's in charge of getting the kids up and dressed and have breakfast. And then he gets the older one to school. And then our babysitter Prabhu comes and takes care of Eve during the day. And I work. So I'm like working until 3 o'clock Pacific time. And then it's preschool pickup. And it's like work is over. And then, I certainly have like a period of like, I'll do emails and look at stuff on the side after that. But like work is, there's no expectation that I'm going to get stuff done from 3 until 8 p.m. And so it's kind of created this like these dividing lines that I find personally helpful, because it makes me, when I'm like with both little girls at 4 o'clock in an afternoon and we're at the playground and like they want to show me the new way they've learned how to climb on the monkey bars, like that gets me out of my like, oh, I should have asked this instead, or how that's not going to cut together. Like it's just like I'm present. Mostly, usually try to be. I think the other way it's changed the show, I mean, I would be interested to hear what listeners think, but like, I think I think about people's parents when I'm interviewing them. Like I didn't really expect that, but like, oh, how did your family unit absorb what was happening? Or, I pay attention to what people tell me about what parents did or didn't do that felt harmful. Like I'm like, just like I studied being an adolescent girl, I'm studying how to be a supportive, loving parent who also sets you up to be, a confident, successful person in the world. So those are some things that I think about.
Do you ever think ahead? You have 2 girls. And girls, I mean, well, I guess girls, boys, whatever, with kids, it's always a mixed bag. And then they become teenagers and just all the sanity goes out the window. And I'm curious about how you see your work having tough conversations. Like in the coming years, your kids are going to get older. They're going to slam the door on you a time or two. They're going to say, I don't want to talk about it. We all went through the same thing as teenagers. When you think about how your work has helped other people, how do you think it's going to help you over the next 10, 20, 30 years? If that's how long you want to keep doing it, and I'm sure we're all curious.
How will my work? I think my work, when I really try to feel hopeful about it, I think maybe doing this work and thinking about how to do it, like, writing this about how do you have a conversation about tender stuff that's successful? Like, what's the way you start that conversation? I hope that makes me, that is preparing me to be a listening, curious parent. Like, I feel like a really important job of a parent is to figure out how to know your child, like see your child. I mean, alongside that is the task of like telling them how not to be jerks in the world and how to be like, you know, like tell them how to be.
Right.
But you also want to see who they are. Like it's not just one thing. But so I hope that I can like I hope that this is making me maybe prepared to do that. And then I also think like the thing about even little kids and certainly teenagers, like they show you that you can't force a conversation that your conversation partner is not ready to have with you or does not want to have that particular conversation with you. Like, so I think that like my instinct is always like, oh, let's get into it. Let's do it, you know? But I think that like, it's, you know, my kids have shown me like, you can't pick those spots always. Like you have to sort of, you kind of like, you want to just like plant a little seed and then see if or drop a little, I don't know what the metaphor is. You sort of drop a little something and then see if they pick it up, and then you can open up the conversation. So you want to make sure the thing is dropped so that they know that they can ask about that, you know, like, you know, we talk about death with our kids, and like, we try to be like, right now it's like, oh, we're sad that her father is gone. Right now she is sad and we're going to remember him. Like, he's not here anymore, but let's talk about what we remember about him, you know? So I like, it's like creating just those little openings. So there's at least some words or conversation for these hard things, so that when, you know, like, you know, on the drive home from preschool, when my daughter says something like, you know, something just like really jarring about like death being really final, I'm like, okay, you're thinking about this, you know, like, okay, like now okay, and how does that make you feel? And like, then she'll switch to another subject, and I'm like, okay, you know.
We're getting close to time, but there is a last and very important question that I want to ask you, because I'm asking it for me and I'm asking it for everyone else out there. So the past 4 years in this country have been incredibly difficult. Speaking as a reporter and a human being, as somebody who has lost more than one good friend over the last 4 years in a very polarized and divided time, we are existing in a space in which people don't even agree on the same facts. They are living in what we often shorthand call completely separate worlds, although maybe that's a stupid shorthand, but it works, I think. What is the benefit of having hard conversations at a particular time like this, when mistrust is really high, when misunderstanding is really high, and when misinformation is off the charts? What's the optimistic outcome here?
I think there's a couple different answers to this question, because I think about this a lot. Like, am I doing something that is building back something that is really missing? Like when I think about, am I doing what I ought to be doing in this moment in this country? Like, that's the question that I turn over in my head. And one answer is, you know, it's not just like, we often talk about it like we're polarized and like it's so hard to talk to people who are different and we're in different worlds. But even people who like occupy the same worlds as you, like, we're not, there's a lot that could also that could be done to reinforce our connections with people who in relationships that we're not tending to. And what I mean is, because of what's huge structural changes to how our economy works and how our communities look and where we gather, like online instead of in person, like there's a lot of ways in which, like, when you are struggling with something, you can be very alone, like very, very alone. It's you and Google and whatever Reddit thread you find. And I that's like part of the mission of the book, is to say, like, we actually need to be talking about this stuff and not thinking we can just sort of present that we've got it figured out when we're out in the world and not engage and stare at our phones and then figure it out on our own. Like, when you talk about this stuff in relationship, you are comparing notes, you're building community, you're realizing the thing that you feel the most ashamed and isolated around is not something that you alone are going through. And even just like so much of just the economy now is like it's on our shoulders in different ways. Like now we don't have pension plans, we have individual retirement accounts, we have just like that example, like it's on our shoulders to figure it out on our own. So we need to build the informal networks and relationships to help us through that. So we have to learn how to talk about this stuff in our personal lives. The separate part of your question is like, how and should we talk to people who we are very different from and vehemently disagree with and have very different worldviews? I think yes and no. I don't think there's an answer to that. I think it's for people, I have a life right now that is unusual in America, which is I spend a lot of my time in Berkeley, California. And then I spend a lot of time in Northwest Wyoming, and those political environments are very different. And the ways in which, I was there during the pandemic in Cody, and like the ways people talked about coronavirus and masks, and it was just very different contexts. And so I know when you say people are really different, like I can picture a face here and picture a face there. And I'm like, how do I talk to those two different, very different people? And it goes back to like that idea of my West Virginia-ness. Like I want to enter a conversation with like, without thinking like I have you all figured out. I know how you do this. Like, I know, like, oh, you think that, like, you fool, like, don't, and so certainly there's going to be things in both environments where I feel like, oh, we really don't move through the world in the same way. But I want to sort of like, I personally try to take a sort of position of, and a posture of like, what's the thing that we can talk about? Like, what's the thing that like we both think is cool? You like horses? Let's talk about horses first. And then let's talk about, I want to know about your family. And I'll tell you about my family. And like, and then as you get to know each other, then you can bring in like, oh, I really don't agree with you there. Like, I really like, what about, you can bring in personal examples to sort of challenge what they're missing from their worldview. And because you're their friend now, you have that opening. That said, that's not always possible. Like there are people who are hostile and mean-spirited and hateful. And I'm not advocating for just trying to, like passively listening because it's doing something for democracy. Like that's not how I work either. But I think a sort of like, just, I do think it's important to just remember when you're moving through the world that there's a lot that you don't know, and that you can be taught when you are curious about other people.
Anna Sale, the new book is called Let's Talk About Hard Things. Read it in bed, read it with a glass of wine, read it with a pint of ice cream, kick everyone else out the house and read it. It's a wonderful book. Anna, you have spent years doing the work, sincerely, no cliche intended, having the hard conversations, digging deep, doing it even though it is uncomfortable, even though it means I have to listen to stories about people's sex lives. And I think everybody listening really, really appreciates you and what you've brought and the way you've helped us all connect and continue to connect. So thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this. And have a wonderful night out there in the Bay Area.
Thank you, Noel. I just also want to say thank you for doing this with me. And thank you for being my friend and my colleague who has shown me, like, what I've learned from you is like, you talk about hard things, but you also do it with this incredible sense of like willingness to laugh at all things. And that's really, really an important skill as well. So thank you very much.
And thank you to everyone watching and listening. We really enjoyed having you. You will love the book. Everyone, I hear it's beautiful in New York. It's beautiful here in DC. It's always beautiful in California. So everyone, go out there and have a great night. Bye.
Bye.